There was darkness, not with the cold that she had once associated with the black hours, not with a sense of night or time. It was a stifling darkness that echoed with soft, wet sounds of rhythmic movement, the insistent pulse of body against body, but far from any act of love. It was the black of a huge machine, steadily devouring light, continually working, thrumming, eating, building toward the inevitable scream. The darkness was the dragon, calling her name, calling its prey, and there was no escape. Quiet now. Machiko Noguchi was in her childhood room. She couldn't find the green crayon. There was the jade one, and the blue-green, but the emerald green was missing, and it was the only color that would work for the dragon's eyes. She sighed and carefully dumped out the crayon pack. Things had been going so well until now, it wasn't fair. It was her day off from school, and she had received permission to play quietly in her room for 2 whole hours before dinner time. The picture of the dragon was going to be a gift for her father. She knew that he had been talking about a promotion for a long time, and that today he had an important meeting with his supervisor. And the green was misplaced. Her parents had taught her to put things in their place because order was a very important rule. Knowing where things were was a crucial ingredient to a successful life. She felt vaguely anxious as she sorted through the different shades. What if it wasn't there? What then? Machiko spotted the crayon and nodded to herself. She had put it in with the blues by mistake, that was all. It was understandable. She would just have to be more careful. She heard the front door open and close downstairs as she meticulously shaded in the dragon's eyes, emerald with gold rims. A cool spring breeze wafted in through her open window with the sounds of small children playing down the street. A good day, and it was going to be a beautiful picture, a long-tailed, proud dragon with green and lavender scales and red-taloned feet. Machiko frowned and looked up. Her mother had not called out to her. Mother had gone to the store to buy things for a special dinner, her father's favorite dishes. But Mother always called to her when she returned from an errand. Perhaps she had gone back outside to carry in more things. Machiko stood and walked to the door of her tidy room where she paused and listened. Maybe she had not heard her mother come in after all. The house was very still. She was about to go back to her picture when she heard a noise. Mother? Nothing. It had been like a heavy sigh, that noise. From down the hall, her father's study or perhaps her parents' room. Machiko was suddenly not sure if it was a good day at all. The silent house was not peaceful anymore. It was empty. She walked very slowly down the hallway, staying close to one wall. Her feet seemed like lead. With each step, her fear increased. Her mother would have surely answered, wouldn't she? Who was in their house? Should she leave? Yes, Machiko decided it would be good to wait outside for her mother to return. She would say that she heard a noise and her mother would know what to do. Except the front door was past the study, past her parents' room. Machiko felt her legs trembling. The back of her neck was damp and sticky, and her stomach felt as if it were made of stone. She took another tentative step and hesitated, and she heard another noise. All at once, Machiko relaxed. It was her father. That was the sound of his chair creaking back, as familiar a sound as his voice or the clatter of his keycards. She straightened up and started toward his door, smiling in relief. He had come home early, that was all. "Father," she began, and reached out to knock. "I thought..." Her words faltered as the door to his study swung inward. She had time to register surprise that he had left it unlatched before she saw him, before she saw the knife. And the blood. Machiko screamed and ran to her father's side, where she pleaded and cried for him to get up, to speak, to stop pretending. She pulled at him for a long time. When she finally fell to the floor, she was drenched in his blood. He opened his eyes and sat up, smiling gently at her, arms spread. "This is for you, Machiko," he said, and embraced her. Except now his arms were claws, and his head was a dragon's. His forked tongue flickered out as his gold-rimmed eyes began to bleed emerald tears. He pulled back to look at her as she began to wail in terror. "You are my child," the words rasped from his dragon face. "Redeem me." "Machiko." Light blared, loud and unwanted. Noguchi started, sat up. She rubbed her eyes. "What?" Hiroki stood in her doorway, his hand on the control panel. She shook her head. I had a dream. Hiroki, what time is it? Almost noon. Hiroki smiled apologetically. I know you were up late last night. Sorry to disturb you. What is it? Noguchi felt the last of the dream slip away as her eyes adjusted to the brightness. She was suddenly aware that she wore only an undershirt, and a tight one at that. Doc Revna still hasn't returned, and Mrs. Doc is starting to worry. I've sent out a crew in the copter to search for him, but I thought it would be best if the staff saw that you were in on this too. Noguchi nodded. Thank you, Hiroki. You're right. Give me 2 minutes to get dressed. Hiroki averted his eyes politely as she walked to the fresher to splash water on her face. Revna wasn't back? He'd been gone 15 or 16 hours at least. Too long. She dressed quickly and rinsed her mouth with water. In spite of the cool liquid, she felt hot, her eyes sticky and full of sand. Not enough sleep. She combed through her hair with her fingers and stepped out to meet Hiroki. She glanced longingly at her bed. A nap later, perhaps. Doc had probably just had some engine trouble. He would know to stay put and wait for help. Hell, the copter was likely on its way back with Revna already. Nothing to worry about. Except the darkness. She donned her sunglasses and followed Hiroki into the blazing day. Machiko's dreams had persisted with more intensity than ever before since her residency on Ryushi and the months of solitude that left her mind to wander. The dragon, her father, Akira Noguchi, the embezzler, the one who brought shame to her family, who took his own life, leaving the death poem for his daughter to find. These events replayed in these dreams to her youth and the event that would reshape the course of her life. Dachande, the brave one, also dreamed. They were of his brother, Neheminde, and the youthful ambitions they shared, aspiring to be the hunters unparalleled in their skill and status. In these dreams he replayed the glorious victory of his first hunt, killing the hard meat and searching for his brother to share in the moment that would be their blooding. But Neheminde had fallen, taken by monsters. What should have been the best moment of his life was marred by personal tragedy, though the elders showed no patience for his grief, and it would have to be set aside. Now, after the explosion that destroyed their craft and the hunt gone awry, left in the sleep near death, the cycle of memories played over. Now, in the search for his brother, he spun through the smoking field of battle and found Tichinde, the reckless, hot-headed student. He called for vengeance. He demanded the blood of the Umans. David Spanner had a nasty headache. The pressors on the copter were incredibly noisy. No, more than that, they were deadly. That was it. He had been sent out because of all his sins, to die by slow torture. Loud torture. How about after this we go out to the cafe and get some sushi, Spanner? Nice and fresh. Fuck you very much, Akita. Great. Only big party of the year, everyone in town is sleeping it off, and he gets sent to pick up the doc. With the only person in town who wasn't suffering a severe hangover. Akita pulled up on the stick as they rounded a cliff and flew into the gorge. Spanner's stomach protested at the sudden dip. He wrapped his arms around his chest and closed his eyes, taking deep breaths. They flew without talking for a few minutes, but it was far from silent. The pressers. It was the goddamn age of science, and no one had invented a decent muffler. What were the techs thinking? Spanner considered jumping. At least it would be quiet. What the fuck? Spanner sat up quickly. They had just come over a low cliff, and on the floor of the gorge, there had been an explosion. A big one. Huge metallic arches like the ribcage of a giant stretched up from the still smoldering wreckage. The charred ground around the arches were strewn with large chunks of blackened debris. Of what, Spanner couldn't tell. His hangover was forgotten. As Akita started to set down on the edge of the site, he wished he had thought to bring a weapon more powerful than a Rhynth stick. It's a ship, isn't it? Spanner scanned the gorge side to side. Lots of places to hide. Yeah, I think so. Akita's eyes were wide. Was a ship, but not any human design I recognize. She shut off the pressers. The sudden silence wasn't so welcome anymore. Spanner gripped his Rhynth stick tightly. They got out of the copter carefully and walked toward the burnt-out shell. It was very quiet. Spanner's fear dissolved into awe as they neared the towering arcs. Incredible, Akita said softly. Spanner nodded, and from the smell of it, the fire had been recent. Like yesterday, maybe. Think of what this means, Akita. We're talking intelligent life here. Not just some new strain of amoeba. This could be the first real proof, you know? Think of the new information. If we could figure out who made this ship, could figure out some way to test this material. He trailed off, mind alive with the possibilities. Why don't you just ask him? Spanner twisted around to see Akita crouched down by a fallen figure. He stepped closer. It wasn't human. Some sort of armored animal, but humanoid form, except this thing was big. Spanner himself stood a little under 2 meters, and he was probably the tallest man in Prosperity Wells. This guy had half a meter on him, easy. Jesus fucking Christ. Careful, Akita. I think it's dead, she said, and then watched the figure for a second. Spanner joined her. No, it's breathing, said Spanner. What the fuck? Akita shaded her eyes and looked up at him. You tell me, she said quietly. Her words sounded flat in the hot, dry air. The initial anxiety he had felt surged back. They were an open target down here, and maybe this guy's friends were nearby. He looked at the steep walls of rock on either side of them and suddenly felt claustrophobic. Let's get out of here. What say? Akita nodded and dropped her gaze back to the creature. Yeah, but help me get him into the copter first. We'll have to come back to look for Revna later. They loaded the thing into the copter as quickly as possible, considering he weighed about a ton. They did their best to strap him to the stretcher with the human-sized bonds. It was a tight fit. When they finally lifted, Spanner felt relieved. No way he was coming back later unless everybody else in town came with him. On the trip home, he kept his eyes open and aimed at their passenger. His headache had crept back, and it pulsed sharply at his temples as the suns beat down hard in their piercing shafts of brightness. Dr. Miriam Revna was an attractive woman, even when she was worried, which she was, in spite of her calm composure. The lines on her brow and the concern in her smile gave her away. Noguchi felt an instant sympathy for the woman. Her attempt to maintain cool and continue functioning in spite of her emotions was a state Noguchi was quite familiar with. Is there anything you can think of that might help us locate your spouse? Hiroki said. Revna walked over to an examination table and motioned for them to join her. He went to Iowa Gorge to find more of these, she said, and lifted a plastic sheet to expose some kind of spider. Hiroki frowned and stepped closer. They're unclassifiable, the doctor continued. Their structure bears characteristics of both carbon-based and silicone-based life forms. Noguchi nodded. Yes, I read the report, but what made him decide to look all the way up in Iowa Gorge? Revna smiled weakly. That's where she said she found them. She? Noguchi and Hiroki almost spoke in unison. The doctor nodded. Jamie Roth, the young woman who works for Ackland. Thank you for your time, Noguchi said. We will contact you as soon as we know anything, Dr. Revna. She smiled warmly and touched the older woman's hand. I'm sure everything will be fine. They walked into the searing heat together and started toward the garage. What would Roth be doing at Iowa Gorge? Hiroki said. Ackland doesn't have any herds within 20 clicks of there. Those things weren't found in Iowa Gorge, Hiroki. Of course, it was obvious when she thought about it. What? Hiroki stopped to look at her. Think about it. If you were Ackland and you found some new life form the night before the roundup, would you risk having 3 years' profit tied up in quarantine? No. You'd say the creature was discovered far from where your herd was pastured. But why would he report it at all? The things we saw might not be any threat to the Rhynth. I mean, if they were like ticks or something, they'd be easy to spot. Noguchi felt a spark of anger deep in her gut. To cover his ass. Say his Rhynth do come down with some disease. Maybe the crab things are carriers. They bite an animal and infect it. He's done his duty, right? He reported it, even though they were found a long way from his animals. Hiroki nodded thoughtfully. So do we talk to Ackland first, or Roth? Roth. She'd be more likely to admit to something like this than Ackland. Besides, if we go to Ackland first, he might bribe her to stay quiet before we can get to her. Hiroki smiled appreciatively. Good thinking, Machiko. Noguchi barely heard him. If anything has happened to Kesar Revna, Ackland will be sorry, she said softly. He sent the doc to chase dust up there. He could have had an accident, hurt himself, and that's a long way from help. After the Uman craft left, Tichinde and the others moved back to the smashed and burned wreckage to see what they had done. Miklide had wanted to kill them, but Tichinde had held them back. He had a better idea. Dachande was gone. He'd been dead already, of course, but the humans were crazy. In a way, it was fitting. The Umans had taken the old leader, had left him to be the new one. He was a warrior now. Asigan had been his first kill, and so he would lead them to their first hunt. Later, he would blood himself, design his own mark and etch it in place with hardmeat thwei, and he would also mark the other students as his own. The Uman craft had surely gone in the direction of their dwellings, and if not, it did not matter. They would go and find the ugly small ones wherever they might be. It was only a matter of how long it would take, and that was not a concern. They had nothing, if not plenty of time. Far outside from Prosperity Wells, at the Sheldon Residence, Bobby Jr. was finishing math homework when his mother called him for lunch. Bob Sr. would soon be home. He walked back into the living room of their small house and looked out the window for Dad. Tomorrow was a school day, which he looked forward to as usual. Not that class was so great, but it was the only time of the week that he got to hang out with the guys. They lived too far out of town for him to go every day, like some of the other kids. Although he'd gone to see the ship come in last night, that had been cool. He played spy tag with Dal and Alan and hung and eaten about a ton of banana popsicles. Bobby heard his dad before he saw him. Actually, he heard Dax first. The dog always sounded like a bike out of fuel after a morning's work. Dax padded into view a few seconds before his father and headed straight for the water dish at the side of the house. "Hey, how's the best 11-year-old in the world?" Bob Sr. opened the door in a blast of hot air and smiled at Bobby. The joke was old, but Bobby grinned. He was the only 11-year-old on the whole planet, at least for another month. "What's for lunch, hun?" Dad stood in the doorway and patted his thigh. "Come on, Daxter, we don't have all day." Dax hurried inside and Dad shut the door against the simmering heat. Mom walked into the room and smoothed her short blonde hair down. She smiled at Dad and kissed him on the cheek. "Tuna casserole." "Tuna? Where'd you get tuna?" "I traded some of our jerky for 3 cans of it from one of the Lecter's crew." She sounded pleased with herself. "Good deal. Maybe tomorrow when you take Bobby in, you can see what else you can get." Bobby followed them into the dining room and listened to them talk about their days. Dad's boss, Mr. Cho, was going to give him a raise. Mom still wanted to build another room onto their small house, a reading room. And there was a rumor that some of the Rhynth had contacted a virus of some kind, although none of Cho's got sick. "It's probably just talk," his father said. "Like that thing about the flies last year, that had everyone going crazy until the doc declared the whole thing a farce." Mom spooned the casserole onto their plates. Dax ran into the room and started to whine. "Hey, no chance, Daxter. You'll get yours later." Dad reached for the water pitcher. Dax whined louder and went to the front door. Dad sighed and pushed back from the table. "Good timing, Dax. Why couldn't—" He stopped short as Dax growled at the door, teeth bared. Bobby stood. "What is it, boy? What's the matter?" Dax continued to growl and then barked, the sound deep and fierce. "Bob?" Bobby's mother wore a look of concern. Bobby started around the table, but his dad motioned him back. Dax barked again. "One of those damn briar wolves again," his father said, and he went to the door. "I thought we'd gotten them all." He picked up the gun that they kept by the coat rack and checked it, and then opened the door. "Sick 'em, Dax." Dax ran outside full speed, his barking a continuous war cry. Dad stepped onto the porch, Bobby and his mother behind him. Dax stopped in the middle of the yard and circled, growling. He acted like there was something there, but there wasn't. The dog backed away and edged forward, all the time barking and growling at nothing. Bobby's eyes widened. There was something. A ripple of dust and light. Dax flickered like he had gone into some kind of magnifier as he circled again. Bobby felt his mom's hands grip his shoulders. "Dad, what?" "Both of you back in the house now." His mother pulled him backward, but he still watched. And he saw as Dax was lifted off the ground in a gout of blood. A huge beast, a monster, appeared from out of nowhere. He held the spear stuck into Daxter. Bobby heard a dull sound like an axe hitting meat. Dax made one short howl of pain and then went quiet. "Good God," his father whispered. The monster was tall, masked, inhuman. It shook the dead dog on its spear, sent a rain of blood to the ground. "Be careful, Bob!" His mother almost screamed it. Bobby was petrified, unable to look away. "Dax?" He watched as the monster tossed the dog over its shoulder and turned to face his father. Dad brought the weapon up and aimed. There was a sudden shift and creak from the roof, like when Dad had pitched the tiling, like somebody was up there. A ripple of light and dust plunged into his father's skull. Bobby screamed. Dad reached up to clutch at the now visible metal claws that had worked into his face. Mom spun him to face the kitchen. Her breath came in short gasps. "Run, Bobby." "Mommy, Run. We have to get to the truck. Out the back." He tripped and sprawled to the floor. His mother pulled him up and shoved him toward the rear door. There was a giant splintering crunch from the front porch. Bobby and his mother both turned. The monster crouched in the doorway. Impossibly fast, it reached for Mom, grabbed her, and ripped her throat open. Once again, the sound of meat being cut. Warmth dotted Bobby's face, turned his vision to red. He screamed, "Mom!" He ran. There was no time to think, only move. The flyer, outside his parents' room. Daddy had shown him how. Bobby ducked across the hall and into their bedroom. Without a pause, he ran and jumped through the thin plastic window. There was another scream, his, as the window shattered, and there was the bike within reach. He hit the ignition button as if he had ridden 1,000 times. The machine roared to life, raised up from the ground. And behind him was the sound of some evil bird screeching, hoarse and piercing. And the bike lurched forward, pulled him away. There was another, and another of the murdering creatures, all claws and hate. They came out of nowhere, appearing like magic. They reached for him, and he took off, tilted wildly. He aimed the bike east, toward town. He kept his sweaty hand jammed to the accelerator. Behind him, the things howled and screamed. There was a noise like gunfire, but hollow, and the wall of rock in front of him to the left exploded, sharp pieces hammered to the bike, stuck into his skin. But it didn't matter. It didn't hurt. And beyond that, Bobby knew nothing. Tichinde was pleased. True, they had lost one, but they had faced the deadly Umans and come away unscathed. 2 kills. The escaped one would die soon enough, with the rest. It had surely gone to alert the others. They would have to be prepared. Tichinde watched as the other Yautja danced and cried over the victory. He himself had killed the second Uman. It had been without weapon, but as dangerous as he had heard Umans to be, that was allowable. Hunt or be hunted. Dachande would have disapproved. Tichinde flared his tusks in amusement at the thought. Dachande was dead. His opinion no longer held meaning. Besides, with no one to hold judgment over their actions, they would take what they wanted. From what he had seen so far, the Umans were not so dangerous as the Yautja had been led to believe. Rhynth cleaned the dirt from under her nails with her teeth. It was a nervous and dirty habit, but considering the circumstances at the moment, she didn't really give a flying fuck about biting her nails. The 2 heads of Chigusa on, World stood over her small table in the rec center and glowered at her. Creep snuffled blissfully by her feet, probably thrilled to get out of the sun. She wished she felt the same. "Do you know what charges you could face if Ackland's Rhynth turn up infected with dangerous bacteria or a virus?" Hiroki had always been an amiable sort, but his eyes flashed with anger. At her. "And you were responsible for sending them to Earth." Rhynth opened her mouth to speak, but was cut off by the Noguchi woman. "Miss Rhynth, if anything has happened to Kesar Revna, you will be held accountable." She leaned toward Rhynth, expression cold. "How do you feel about that? He's been missing for almost a day now. He might be injured or dead." Rhynth nodded slowly. She had lied for Ackland, had put her reputation at stake for him. After all, he was the boss. But she wasn't about to get caught holding this bag. It was just a little bit too heavy. "Ackland told me to," she said quietly. "I realize that doesn't excuse my actions, but I just work for the man, you know?" Hiroki and Noguchi exchanged glances. "So Ackland told you to tell Revna that the spider creatures were in Iowa Gorge?" Noguchi leaned forward again, but her eyes weren't as angry as before. Right. What the hell is going on here? Roth looked up, surprised. Ackland marched across the room, his face sweaty and red. Roth, what have you done? Ackland stopped at their table and glared down at her accusingly. What's this I hear about you lying to Doc Revna? Roth felt raw anger hit her system. He was going to let her take the fall, after she'd worked her ass off for him for 3 years. What a surprise. Mr. Ackland, I've already explained the situation, and I quit. I'll expect to be paid within the month. Roth nodded at Noguchi and Hiroki. So, you were planning to try me in absentia? Don't you need a judge to hold trial? Or is that some old-fashioned notion? Shut up, Ackland. Stunned, he did. You've violated company policy and jeopardized the security of this complex and its personnel, Ackland. I figure that's all the legal authority I need. Noguchi was royally pissed, but she kept her voice low. This overblown rancher had the gall to try to screw things for everyone, and then cover it up. You really think you've got the backing to make charges stick? In case you haven't noticed, you aren't exactly the most popular person in this settlement. Ackland was shaken, she could tell, but he smirked at her. You're right, I'm just the new boss. She had to make a conscious effort not to shout. But Doc Revna has been here since the beginning, treating the rancher's stock, treating their families, delivering their babies. So far, he's just missing. But if he turns up dead, who do you think folks are going to side with? You? Or his grieving widow? Ackland seemed to shrink a little in front of her. Look, I didn't expect the doc to go out looking for more of those things. Hiroki stepped in. But if he did, you wanted to make sure he looked in the wrong place. Ackland flared again, but his anger seemed weak. We had no way of knowing whether those Rhynth were infected or not. I didn't want to delay the whole operation. Hiroki frowned angrily and pointed his finger at the rancher's chest. Didn't it occur to you that trouble with your herd could be the reason the Lecter is still parked out front? Noguchi raised her eyebrows. What? I meant to tell you. Hiroki started, but she already headed to one of the wall screens. She punched up a southern compound view and looked in disbelief. Those Rhynth are going to be hell to manage after standing in the sun all day. She turned to glare accusingly at Ackland. He looked away. Noguchi tapped into operations. Collins appeared in front of her. Collins, why hasn't the Lecter taken its first load back to its orbiter? I couldn't say. Machiko, we've been trying to contact them all day, but they haven't responded. Send someone in person. Collins nodded. I'll go myself. Good. And don't waste your time with Conover. Talk to Strandberg. Remind him we're on a tight schedule. Report back immediately, okay? Gotcha. The screen went blank. At least that was taken care of. She walked back to the table where Ackland had sat down, his face blank. If this has anything to do with your little lie, Ackland, she said smoothly, calmly, I'll see to it that you are put away for it, until hell freezes over. The look in his eyes, defeated and guilty, was exactly what she wanted. Scott ached all over. It was the hangover, and that Japanese woman. She was responsible. Except he couldn't move his arms, and he was standing up. He opened his heavy eyelids and blinked several times. It was dark, but he was inside. There was weak light coming from somewhere. Tom. His voice was a raspy croak. God, he was thirsty. He cleared his throat and tried again. Tom, can you hear me? No answer. Was he in a med center, maybe? There might have been some kind of accident. He took a deep breath and spoke as loud as he could. Hello? Where am I? A slow hissing filled the room. The shadows in the room moved, unfurled themselves from the walls and the dark corners. He could make out teeth. Jesus. He tried to move, but his arms were pinned. Oh God, no. His voice was barely a whisper. The room swam with darkness, and then once again, there was nothing. The company has billions invested in this project, she continued. Where the hell do you get off fucking with us? Not to mention possibly endangering the lives of millions, maybe billions of people. You think the quarantine laws are there just for the fun of it? She was still on a roll and unwilling to topple her down. Ackland hadn't spoken for several minutes. Neither had Hiroki. Well? Ackland looked up at her and said nothing. The tension was broken by an incoming message over Noguchi's comm. Miss Noguchi, report to the med center immediately. Miss Noguchi, to the med center. Miriam Revna. She sounded agitated. Noguchi tapped the received button and looked at the rancher. You'd better pray they've found Revna, Ackland. I didn't make him go out there, and if he hurt himself, it's his own fault. She hurried out of the rec center and was blasted by the afternoon heat. The three of them stepped into the lab together. Noguchi saw what was strapped to an examination table and took in a deep breath. To scream or faint, she didn't know. She thought of the dragon. So much for your precious quarantine, said Ackland softly. Noguchi closed her mouth. Miriam Revna and two local pilots were looking at a readout on a small screen across the lab. One of the pilots, Spanner, turned and grinned. Hey, look what we found. He pointed at the creature unnecessarily. Hiroki took a step toward it and then paused. Is it alive? Miriam Revna stood and walked over. Yes, it's injured, but not in any danger. At least, I don't think so. 4 cracked ribs and extensive contusions in the dorsal region. And it's male, I'm fairly certain. The thing was a giant, maybe 2.5 meters tall. Humanoid, but its head like some sort of mutated crab. It wore armor and was bound to the exam table by several thick straps of Rhynth hide. Its long, taloned arms were speckled, reptilian, but not scaled. Noguchi saw the slight rise and fall of its chest. There was a mask over its face. What was it breathing? She wondered. After the initial shock, she tried to remember what the company's off-planet manual contained on the subject of possible XT encounters. Something like, avoid direct contact until trained personnel arrive. Looks like we're going to write a new chapter, she thought. We found a ship, too, Spanner said. It's mostly blown to shit, but we should get a salvage team up there. Noguchi found her tongue. Any idea what it is, Doctor? Revna looked at her blankly. I'm sorry, I'm not thinking clearly today. Noguchi nodded. Of course. We are still looking for Kesar. I just wondered if there was any connection between this and those unclassifieds that Roth brought in. The doctor shook her head. This creature has a completely different cell structure. No relationship at all. She nodded at the monster. He is more like us than the little crab-like things. Hiroki walked over to a table covered with pieces of the alien's armor. He held up a broken staff tipped with a vicious-looking blade. Quite an arsenal. Noguchi joined him and picked up a large chunk of dark metal with a strap. She could barely lift it. At closer inspection, it was apparently some kind of weapon, a rifle or flamethrower. It was damaged. She set it down and picked up a mask. This is stuff you'd pack for a hunting trip, or an invasion, she said. This guy's no peaceful explorer. Hiroki fingered the strap on the odd weapon. I don't think this is his first trip to Ryushi either. I can't place the rest of it, but this strap is definitely Rhynth hide. Any sign of the dock? Ackland nodded at the pilots. The slender young woman, Akita, sighed. Negatory, but Iowa Gorge is a maze of canyons. It'd be easy to get lost. We'll go back out pretty soon. There was a plate of armor of some kind with the other weaponry. It was the head of an unknown animal or bug. An elongated skull with sharp teeth and no eyes. She traced her finger along it thoughtfully. This is familiar. I've seen it somewhere. Was it a dream? It was dark and hot. She looked again at the unconscious alien and shuddered. Maybe Doc Revna hadn't gotten lost. There was a scream from outside, followed by a crash. Noguchi started. What now? She and Hiroki ran to the door together with Ackland behind them. A flyer had slammed into the transmitter building directly across from the med center. There was no fire, but a lot of oily smoke. A small body lay on the hot pavement next to the accident. Several others had come out of the ops center and were also running toward the scene. Hiroki got there first. "What happened?" Noguchi called out. Hiroki knelt by the victim and carefully touched his face. "It's the Sheldon boy," he said. Noguchi looked down at the child's still, tear-streaked face and felt her heart tighten. So young. The boy opened his eyes and started to scream. He sat up quickly and looked around. He was in Prosperity Wells. There were a bunch of people gathered around him, and the flyer lay nearby, broken. "Bobby," said a calm voice. Mr. Shimura was next to him. "Are you hurt?" "Monsters," he whispered, and he started to cry. Miss Noguchi was there too. She leaned down next to Mr. Shimura and smiled at him. "It's okay, Bobby. You're safe now. What happened?" He closed his eyes, unable to stop the tears. "Monsters killed my dad, and then my mommy, and then before they killed Dax, and we couldn't see them, but then I got away." He couldn't say anything else. He wanted to tell them how scared he had been, how there were so many of them, and how Dax had seen them first, but all that came out were loud sobs of terror and sadness. "Let's get him to the med center." Gentle hands lifted him off the burning ground and carried him away. One of his legs hurt really bad and he cried harder. Cool air washed over him as they went inside. The world dimmed. "We've got an emergency here, Doc," the person holding him shouted. "Mr. Shimura." Bobby opened his eyes and looked past Dr. Revna at the medical room, and he started to scream again. Just like the tears, he was unable to stop. Fear and hatred and sadness and anger for the thing they had lying on the table. "Monsters! Monsters!" Dachande remembered movement after the loneliness of pain, the new pain. Once, he had opened his eyes and seen that he was indoors, in a moving ship. There had been heat and then cool and strange animal sounds. He realized he could see a little, but could not focus. Dark and light shapes folded and formed in front of him. But now, his gaze sharpened, just for a second, at the horrible cries of some creature in front of him. It screamed and howled its nonsense language, the thing. It was pale and little, like an Uman. Tichinde sank back into the quiet darkness. Fear fought to rise in him. He was caught by monsters. In this series, I'm recounting the trials of Machiko Noguchi and her experiences with the Yautja species. For more on this character, please see the playlist on the end screen and stay tuned for the latest videos. This is a character who has spanned through many of the Aliens vs. Predator comics, including the very first story featuring the creature crossover from Dark Horse Comics. In line with a release similar to their recent Aliens collection, Dark Horse has just published a collection of Aliens vs. Predator: The Essential Comics Volume 1. This is actually the very first time the entire Machiko Noguchi story has been combined into one collection, so if you're looking for some scary reading this Halloween season, I highly recommend checking this collection out. As always, I'd like to thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like, and you can also subscribe for all the latest videos from the channel. A very, very special thanks goes out to WEYLAND YUTANI executives, EmYarUk, Mark Fox, and Lady Anne, part of the Patreon Hive. If you'd like to join the Hive and support the channel, check out my Patreon page for exclusive posts and contests. In the meantime, you can catch up with Alien Theory over social media, follow @alien_theory on Twitter, and @AlienTheoryYT on Facebook and Instagram for more. And until next time, this is Alien Theory, signing off.